Hey everyone, hope you're having a great day today wherever you are. Wazoo here, and this is another video where we create a application from scratch. We're going to be creating a web application today using Java Spring Boot and Thymeleaf for some HTML markup on the front end and some regular JavaScript using jQuery. As you can see in front of you, the application we're going to be building today is a newsreader application. These are popular web applications, usually website driven, where you go to a website, you create an account, you sign up, and you can add a whole list of RSS feeds. And then you'll get a nice, neat presentation of the information being published via RSS from various news sites, entertainment sites, gaming sites all over the web. So here we have on our homepage, we've got a list of the items from our feeds that we have currently enabled. And then if we click on the feeds menu icon, we see that we've got a list of feeds that we've added here. So we've got some names here along with the URL to their RSS information. I think this is going to be a really cool project. It's going to be a nice beginner-ish one to tackle, and it's going to be a really great time. I hope you all are excited about it as I am. All right, let's get started. Okay, so here we are at start.spring.io. This is the common place for creating a new Java Spring Boot project that lets you customize and pick out your starting configuration for your project. So we're going to be creating a Maven project here. We're going to be using Java. We're going to use the latest 3.1.1 release as of today, as of recording. And for the artifact, we're just going to be calling this Spring Boot 3 Newsreader. And then we're going to keep it as a jar. We'll make use of Java 17 here. Okay, so you can see that we've added Spring Boot DevTools, Lombok, Docker Compose support, Spring Web, Spring Data JPA, the MariaDB driver, and Thymeleaf. That's all we need to do. So just hit the generate button, download, and unzip to your favorite place on your hard drive. Okay, so here we are with the project opened in Visual Studio Code, and you can see that we have our basic application files that we get by default from the generator. And along with the new Spring Boot Docker Compose starter, we've got a built-in compose.yaml file, which is what Spring Boot will read and try to create a Docker support as you start up. So we've got a basic services section set up here for MariaDB, and let's go ahead and fill this out a little more. So at the top, let's stick in a version tag of 3.8. And I'm going to rename MariaDB to be just database. We'll keep the image at MariaDB:/latest. And for our environment, we are going to be changing around the section a little bit here. We are going to be using a environment file, which we will not be using an environment file which will not commit to Git or any source repository because it's got all of your secrets in there. So let's just call this .env. That's the typical naming convention for an environment file. And then in the environment section, let's change some of these flags. We are going to be needing a MySQL_database, : and then we'll be using $MySQL database, which will be the environment variable that will read from the file. And you know what? Let's just get rid of all of these. And then let's create a MySQL_password. And again, we'll use $MySQL password. And then we'll create an entry called MySQL root password. And then create this as MySQL root password. And then we'll create a MySQL user and : $MySQL user. We'll map ports 3306 to 3306 internally in the container. We'll define a volume. So we'll create a volume section and call it just db data mapped to var/lib/MariaDB. And then we'll create a network section and just call this Spring Network. Along with the database, we'll create a phpMyAdmin section, and this is so that we have a GUI to log in and take a look at what gets set up in the database. So let's just call this phpMyAdmin, and it depends on database. And then for an image, we'll be using phpMyAdmin / phpMyAdmin. And we'll add a restart flag of unless stopped. And did we do that up here? Okay, let's set a restart flag here of unless stopped as well on our database. Okay, and then back down here, let's create a ports entry. We'll open up 8081 outside of the container mapped to port 80 inside. We'll set up another environment variable, another environment file to be .env, and then an environment section using PMA_host will be database, and then MySQL root password to be string $quote MySQL root password. And then we'll create a networks section, and we'll use the same Spring Network. And then finally, we'll create a volumes section, and we'll just call this DB data, and then another networks section to just define the Spring Network key that we've been using. And we'll just use a driver of bridge. And this should be all you need. Now, if you're wondering why we need MySQL naming convention in front of our MariaDB keys, it's because MariaDB initially started off as an offshoot of the MySQL database project. And so the environment keys work the same in both databases. And this also lets you flip back to MySQL if you would rather use MySQL as your database. Okay, so we've got all that set up. Now we just need to create our .env file. So let's go ahead and in Visual Studio Code, create a new .env in the root of your project. And then we'll just add some new keys. We'll just call this Spring Data. And then MySQL user will be equal to Spring_user. And then MySQL password will be equal to Spring password. And MySQL root password will be equal to root_password. And these will come into, these will come into effect later on when we need to log into phpMyAdmin. Okay, so we have these keys set up in the environment file, and we have our Docker Compose file set up. So now let's go ahead and let's start up our Spring Boot project. Okay, so as you can see, everything looks okay. We've got green lights here on our dashboard in Visual Studio Code. If we go look on our Docker containers, our Spring Boot 3 Docker container up and running, and we've got some volumes created. We've got some images created for MariaDB and the phpMyAdmin. And so if you go back to the browser and open up localhost 8081, this should reach the phpMyAdmin application. Okay, so for logging in, we can use our Spring user. And for password, we can use Spring_password. And then if you log in, you should now be able to see the database setup. We don't have any tables set up in our database, of course, but we've got access to it right here. And this is all looking really good. I'm really happy with this so far. If you go ahead and open up the application.properties file, this is the configuration file to override any of the default Spring Boot configurations. And so in here, we want to just specify spring.jpa.generate DDL equals true. So we want to make sure that Spring Boot initializes our database schema upon startup. And that's about all we need for that. Okay, so now we can get into creating our actual feed, RSS feed item. So in our project over here, let's go ahead and we'll create in the Java source main java/com/example/Spring Boot 3 newsreader folder. Let's create a new folder under here and just call it models. And then we'll create a new feed item model. Okay, so we're using Lombok. So let's go ahead and make use of some annotations. This will be an entity that we want to track in the database. So we need the add entity at data, and then we want the all args constructor and no args constructor, no args constructor annotations. And then we want the ID annotation, and we'll use generated value. All right, let's hide this. Generated value, and we'll use an ID field of ID, and then we'll have a string name, a string URL. So the name will just be the whatever name you want to give this specific news item. So something like feed 1, feed 2, and then for the URL, it'll be the actual RSS link to wherever it is you want to pull the news from. And then we'll just create some local date time stamps, local date time of created at and local date time of updated at. Okay, so we've got all that set up. Now let's go in and create our repository. So back in our Java project folder, let's go ahead and create a new folder at the same level that models are on and create a new one called repositories. And let's create a FeedItem repository. And this will be an interface. And here we want to extend the list CRUD repository class, or interface, sorry. And it takes as parameters FeedItem and long. Add all missing imports. Okay, that looks good. Really simple stuff so far. And we are now going to need a service. So again, back in the root of our Spring Boot 3 newsreader folder, let's create another new folder. We'll call it services. And usually when we have, we'll be setting up our web controller shortly, but our services are there to basically interact directly with the database through the repository instead of doing that in the controller. You usually want to shove off that work into a service. So let's create a new service. We'll call it FeedItemService. And it'll be a class. It'll be a service. And this will just help us work with the feed items in the database. Okay, so we can auto-wire the FeedItem repository. If I haven't mentioned it already, just to let you know, the source code is on the GitHub link given in the description down below. Okay, so we're going to create a getAll method, which will return a list of all the feed items. Return FeedItem repository find all. Okay, and then we want to do a get by ID, so get a single list. So a public optional feed item. And we want to get by ID. And then given the ID that we pass into this, we want to return what we can find in the database. So find by ID, ID. And we'll be returning an optional. We'll be wrapping the result in an optional because we won't know if the object exists in the database or not. Okay, and then finally we'll be adding a method to save a new feed item. So we'll return it back as a feed item model. Okay, so we'll be saving a feed item. We'll pass in a feed item as the parameter here. And so if the feed item ID is equal to null, then it means we've got a new record that we're working with. So let's set the created at date time field to be now. And then let's set the updated at field to be right now. And then finally, let's return the saving of the feed item. So we save the record in the database, and then we return what we saved back out to the controller. Okay, so that's what we have as our service definition here, our service class. Now let's go ahead and create a controller for this. So back in our Java project folder, let's create a new folder here calling it controllers. And then here we'll create a FeedItemController. Okay, and this will be a REST controller. So we'll be using the REST controller annotation because we'll be calling it from, we'll basically be using it as a API from within the application. And then we'll be creating a request mapping here of /API/feedItems. And we are going to auto wire the service. So FeedItemService. And then we're going to be creating a get mapping. And this is essentially to get all of them. So this will be handy on the listing of our feeds. So we'll use a get mapping annotation, and then we'll be returning the list that we get from the service. So list of feed items, get all feed items, and then we'll be returning the feed item service, get all. And then when we want to return a specific feed item, let's use get mapping / curly brackets ID, and then this function will be returning a feed item, and we'll need to use the path variable so that our Spring Boot server knows which ID we're passing via the command or via the request URL. So path variable long ID. And then so what we want to do again is, because we're potentially fetching a unknown feed item, we're going to wrap the result in an optional. So feed item service get by ID. And then what we'll do is we'll create one that will return. So feed item equals null. So if what we returned in the optional is present, so if there's something in there, it means we've got a valid record. Let's set it to be the item, and then we'll just return the item. So basically what happens is if our item is found, if our feed item is found in the database, then we'll return it in the optional, and the present flag will be set to true. So if that's the case, then we'll just pull it from the returned optional and then return that back to the caller. And if it doesn't exist, then what we'll return back is actually null. Okay, and then let's set up a HomeController, and this will be useful for interacting with Thymeleaf and our front-end JavaScript. So back in the controllers folder, let's create another controller here, and we'll call it HomeController. It'll be a class, and this time it'll just be using the controller annotation, not the REST controller annotation. And we'll be using the auto-wired annotation again to set up a instance of the FeedItemService. For our home page, when we want to go to the root page of our application from the browser, we need a get mapping of just a /, and we'll just be returning a string here in the method. I'll just call it root. We'll be using a model. We'll inject a model, Spring UI model instance that will pass back to the front end in Thymeleaf. FeedItemService get all. And then we're going to add those into that UI model with model.addAttribute. And we'll give it a string name of feeds, and then we'll use the data, the actual data. And then we'll return index. Okay, so just to sum it up, we've got our controller, which this is the controller that interacts with our browser requests. So we are auto-wiring the instance of our FeedItemService object, and then we're creating a get mapping function, which will listen for the request for the homepage of our application, basically the /, the default. And then inside the function, we're passing in a reference to a Spring Framework UI model, which is sort of a generic model that gets passed into the Thymeleaf in the front end. We're pulling a list of all of the feed items in the database. We're then adding all of these feed items into the model and then passing it into the index.html view, which is what we're going to create right now. So let's go ahead in our resources folder here. There's the templates, And let's go ahead and create a new file here and call it index.html. So this value here of what you return in the string here has to match the name of the HTML file. So in this case, it's index. So we're going to be creating a index file here. And I'm going to be cutting and pasting HTML here. So we've got a reference in the HTML section to our Thymeleaf library, and then we've got some basic HTML here for just the home page of our application. And let's go ahead and just close off this file with /body/HTML, and then let's start this up and test it out. Okay, so in our browser, if you go to localhost 8080, you should see an empty page for now, but at the top you'll see that it has a newsreader ::home, which is what we defined as the title of this HTML page. So we're looking good. What we're now going to do is we're going to be adding support for Bootstrap CSS into our application via the help of what's called webjars. So webjars are just basic dependencies that have been packaged up into the Maven repository by individual project maintainers. So this gives us a way of pulling in things like jQuery, Bootstrap, rather than using a CDN somewhere. We can have it installed locally. So open up your pom.xml file and just go right into the end of your dependencies section. And let's go ahead and create 2 entries here. One is going to be for the Bootstrap, so we'll call it org.webjars Bootstrap, and then the other one is org.webjars for jQuery. And you'll notice that we'll be using version keys, bootstrap.version and jQuery.version, and we set those above here, back up in the properties section of the pom.xml file. So let's go ahead and add those now. So bootstrap.version, and close that off, and then jQuery.version, and we'll close that off. So for Bootstrap, we're going to be using 5.3.0, and jQuery will be using 3.6.4. That's sort of the latest that I found as of recording this. Visual Studio Code will pull down those POM file packages, and let's go back into our index file and let's make reference. So before the closing body tag here, let's create a script section, and we'll use thsource of ampersand at /webjars /jQuery /3.6.4 /jQuery.min.js, and then we'll do the same for Bootstrap. So script thsource equals at /webjars bootstrap 5.3.0 /js /bootstrap.min.js, and then we'll close off the script file. And then to make use of the CSS, we'll do the same thing and reference the Bootstrap CSS. So we'll add it in as a link to /webjars. Here, I'll just scroll over here. So we've got a link rel style sheet, an href here of webjars, bootstrap 5.3.0 CSS, bootstrap min.css. And let's go ahead and test it again to make sure that everything is loading up correctly. Okay, so if we refresh the page and open the developer tools, we shouldn't see any error down here. If you look at the bottom, you can see that we've loaded the jQuery and Bootstrap files with a status of 200, which means they've been found correctly and everything is looking good. Okay, let's go back to our project. So what we want to do is, along with listing the RSS items of the feeds that we enter, we want to actually be able to enter new feed items. So remember in the demo we had a home page and then a feeds page. So let's go ahead and create the feeds page. Let's go back, and in our templates folder, let's just create a feeds.html and cut and paste everything from index.html over to feeds.html, and then just change the title so that we know we've got a different page. Okay. And then in the HomeController, let's go back to the HomeController. Let's add a section for feeds. So get mapping /feeds, and then we want to return a string. I don't know, we can call it feeds page, and again we'll inject a Spring UI model in there, and then we'll set up another list, a feed item feeds equals FeedItemService get all, similar to what we did before. And we want to add attribute feeds, and then we'll pass in that data again. So same as what we just did. And then we want to add an empty model that we'll be using for when we want to add a new one. So we'll pass in a single feed item. We'll just create a new empty one, and we'll inject it into, we'll create it as a new feed. We'll give it the name of new feed. We'll add that to the model, and then finally we'll return back to our feeds HTML page. Okay, so we've got all that. So let's go ahead and go into the feeds, back to the feeds HTML page. And so you'll see that we've got our Bootstrap and we've got everything set up. And so what we want to do is set up a form for adding a new feed. First, we want to list the feeds, and then we want to add a form for adding a new one. So what we're going to start with is some basic Bootstrap to set up that left-hand navigation the way that we have the menu set up that we saw in the demo. So I'm going to cut and paste in some Bootstrap just because it's a lot to type out, and I'm just using it from a default template. Okay, so this is a big chunk of HTML. So what we're going to be doing is creating a menu, and then we're going to be creating two menu items, which I've got right here in our nav item section. We've got a link back to our home page. So we've got the text here of home, like the menu label of home, and then we've got the href set to &/feeds, which is linking up to the feeds nav item. And this is the Thymeleaf way of creating URLs, clickable URLs. Okay, and then we've got a default section over here. I just left some to-do text, and I'll show you what that looks like. So go ahead and start up the server again. Okay, and let's go ahead and localhost port 8080/feeds. And you can see we've got our HTML set up here, and we've got a to-do section, which is what we left, where we left things off at in the markup. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to make a list of all of the feeds that are currently in the database. So they are currently using they're being pulled into Thymeleaf with that feeds key in the model, if you remember. So what we're going to be doing here is we'll just create a simple HTML table that will go through and iterate each item of that list and create a new row for it. So here we've got a table, class of table. In our header section, so we've got a name column, a URL column, a created at column. And then here is where the loop of where we go through each of the items in that feeds array that we're sending back to the model. So we take out an individual one, and for each one, we're displaying the name. We're giving it a text, like a label of the name field of the object. And then we're displaying the URL, which is the URL field of the object. And then finally, the created at timestamp, which is the created at property of this feed item. Okay, so as you can see, I've pasted in we have our table here, which is what we just went through. And then above the table, we've got a form. So using the Bootstrap class of form inline because we want to create a simple entry form. We've got our action defined using the Thymeleaf THAction property, and we're going to be sending it back to /feeds/new. So I'll show you how to map that to the controller here shortly. And we're going to be making use of that object that we're passing back in the model. Remember that new feed object that we created in the controller? So this is where we reference it in the form. We're going to be using a method of post. And then here we're just using input form controls to display the properties of that new feed object. And so we do that in Thymeleaf with the th::field property or attribute. So we're setting the attribute to be star and then curly brackets, the name of the property. So in this case, it's going to be name. And in this input down here, it's going to be the URL. And then finally, we've got a submit button, as every form does, which is just going to be called add news feed. And again, it'll make use of the th action when we hit submit, which will be going to /feeds/new. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. Okay, so we don't have anything in the database right now, but you can see that we've got the table here. We've got the name field set up here, so we can use anything we want. And for any feed URL, we can just call it Yahoo. It won't matter what we call it. And then so as soon as we hit the add news button, it is going to blow up because it won't know what to do with this. Okay, so usually when I'm working with Spring Boot, I like to separate out some of the controller actions to make it easier to debug what's happening. And I created a different controller all on its own for handling the form. So in your controllers folder, let's call this one FormController. Okay, so FormController.java. So again, we're going to be making use of the controller annotation. We're going to be using AutoWired to have a reference to the FeedItemService service. And then we're going to be creating a post mapping for that form action point, which was /feeds/new. Okay, and so we're going to be returning a string. And let's just call this one create feed item. And we'll be passing in the feed item model that we get from the front end. And let's just go ahead and add all missing imports. Okay, so all we need to do is use the FeedItemService, save with the feed item model that we get from the front end, and then we want to return a redirect back to /feeds. And so all this will do is just basically return us to the feeds page that will then list. It'll call the method that retrieves all of the records, the feed records in the database, and then it will list them on that page. So this is really all we need to do. So let's go ahead and restart our application, and we'll go to /feeds. Okay, you can see our database is still empty. And let's create a new site, or a new entry, sorry. So we'll just call this one foo, and then we'll give this one RSS feed of a valid RSS feed that I found online. So this will be at /rss.art19.com/apology line. And it's just basically a blog I found through Google just to demonstrate pulling in a RSS newsfeed. So let's hit add newsfeed. Okay, so when we hit the add newsfeed, we can see that we've called the controller function, the form controller function correctly. We've got the entry in the database, and now that we've redirected back to this site, it's relisting what we've got in the database. So now what we want to happen is when we go to our home page, we want to display the actual content of those RSS feeds. So that will be the final thing we'll need to do. We'll do that with the help of jQuery. And so we'll go back into the index page, but first we'll copy the same Bootstrap template setup that we have to make use of all of the markup to display those menus. So let's go ahead and copy this from the feeds.html. We'll paste everything into the index page, and then we'll just chop out everything in this section, in this call_py3 section. Okay, so we've got our same navigation setup of feeds, and then we've got our homepage for our newsreader. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an OL list element, ordered list element, and give it an ID of feed content. And then down below, we are going to work with some JavaScript. So we're just going to embed some JavaScript right in this page. Easier demonstration. Okay, so we've got our feed content ordered list set up here. We've got our scripts defined, our tags defined. So now we're going to create another script section. So we're going to use th inline of JavaScript, and this is just a handle to Thymeleaf, or a signal to Thymeleaf to process this JavaScript from Thymeleaf. So because it's Thymeleaf, it processes JavaScript slightly differently when you want to pass variables from the Thymeleaf, so basically from the Spring side into and embedded right into the JavaScript markup of that page. So to begin with, we have to create a comment here, and I'll just cut and paste it. It's called a CData section. We have to have an opening and closing CData tag. And this is basically just some, you only have to do this with Thymeleaf when you're working with JavaScript in Thymeleaf, just because of the way that Thymeleaf processes the JavaScripts. because the usefulness of this is we will see shortly. So we've got a function here for jQuery, like our ready function. So what we want to do is we want to create a handle to our ordered list element. So I'm going to call this $list, and we'll make use of jQuery to just reference the feed content element. And then our data, which is going to be our actual array of feeds, is going to be open bracket string feeds, and this is Thymeleaf specific syntax. And then the default variable for this, or the default value for this, will be a square brackets as an array. So if there's no feeds coming back from the model, then Thymeleaf will just use the empty array for assigning it to data. So we're going to empty our ordered list section. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create a simple for loop and go through each entry in the data array. Okay, so we've got our for loop, and then what we're going to do is make use of the jQuery Ajax call, and we're going to fetch the actual RSS URL. So we'll be using the URL property of that individual data item that we're working with. And so we want to accepts XML, so application/RSS plus XML. And then for the data type of our response, we want to work with XML. And then since the $Ajax method is promise-based, we'll work with the result, the promise, and the result that comes back. So hopefully the result that comes back is a bunch of XML that is our RSS item. So let's go ahead, and if we wrap that into jQuery, so what we want to do is we want to make use of find to look for an items. So what we're going to do is go through each item that we find in the result RSS object result. So first let's assign EL to be $this, and then we'll create a template. So basically an HTML template. And so we'll use a list entry, and then we'll create a div, and we'll give it a class name of dinline, which is a Bootstrap class name. And then we'll create a span for the actual title. So we'll just call it a dblock of a class name, a CSS class name. And we'll make use of $EL find title. And then we want the text from that title. So we want the text block of that title string. And then we want to close off the HTML there. And then we want to add the description, or whatever's defined as a description. So $again, EL, the element, we want to find the description property, and we want to grab the text from there, and we want to only return basically the first 100 characters. You can leave this out if you wish, just so you see the entire result, but I usually, let's make it 125. And then let's close off this span here, and then close off this div. And we've closed off this CLI, so this is all we really need to do. And then once this is done, we just use the $list.append template. So then this will, as we go through each item that we find in the RSS result, it will create this HTML template, which is the title of that entry and the description, any description that it finds, and then append the HTML to the list that we have. And then if there's any kind of error in that initial request, then let's just log it out in the HTML. So let's just use catch and then function error, and then just console error. And that really should be all we need to do. This is pretty nice and simple and pretty basic. Okay, so let's go ahead and run it all up. And you can see we now have our menu navigation setup that we put in, the CSS and HTML for home and feeds. And then we've got our list coming back from the RSS feed that we entered here, this apology line RSS feed. It's now being looped through and displaying right here. This is all I wanted to do for this application today. I think this is a really great starting point for you to add to and just play with, have fun with it. Do whatever you want. Display it in different sizes and different fonts. Maybe instead of generating this as a list, you could create it as tiles that you could display on this page. I wanted to go even smaller so that this text would be even smaller. That way you could fit a whole bunch of entries on one page, just to really condense what you're getting back from all the different RSS feeds that you've got. But yeah, that's our project today. Look for the source code down below. If you liked this video, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you want to see notifications for more videos like this. Leave any questions or comments in the comment section down below, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks, everyone. Peace.